Welcome to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This is an interesting chapter because this is where Paul gives us a lot of insight into concepts about marriage in the early days of the church. So let's jump into this one. In fact, as we're getting to here, I found a great quote from Eric Huntsman's article, The Wisdom of Man, Greek Philosophy, Corinthian Behavior, and the Teachings of Paul. He made a comment that said, while some of Paul's advice regarding marriage in chapter 7 applied broadly to Christians in Corinth and has similar application today, several difficult passages in this chapter make particular sense when seen in the context of an elitist worldview that downplayed the importance of the body. Whereas the philosophy of some in the congregation had led them to disregard actions in the body, in chapter 7, some of Paul's counsel seems to have been motivated by the claims of an ascetic group whose beliefs led them to extreme practices and self-denial in everything from sexual behavior to dietary practices, thinking that they could please God by denying the body. Their negative view of marriage, together with certain circumstantial factors, led Paul to address whether marital relations were appropriate, and to give advice to specific groups, including the unmarried and widows, and those that married but contemplating divorce, especially those married to unbelievers. He also suggested that at that time, Corinthians ought to consider maintaining the status quo in view of the present distress that he says here, but not let anxiety or carefulness determine their personal state. So when we look at this, we need to be careful, okay? Hopefully you watched our introduction to the New Testament video to gain some more context about how to think about the New Testament. But this is important, okay? So we could read this chapter and just only think about it at a face value and what does that translate or interpret mean for us today. That's one way to look at the scriptures, and that's a very common way to look at scriptures. What we want to do, though, is understand more accurately what it is that Paul is actually talking about. And in order to understand what Paul is talking about, how did he want this to be interpreted? What was the meaning he tried to bring forward through this letter? We have to understand historical context to understand why he's writing this letter the way he is. That can give us new insight into how to properly apply this into our life. So that's what Eric Huntsman's little article was about, the blurb that I just read. Understand, okay, this is to the Corinthian saints. If you've been watching all the videos right all along, you'll understand this. If not, go watch all the videos. We talk about more in detail about the historical context in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. But if you're watching all these videos in series, which I hope you are, because that's the point of doing these videos as regular as we are, is to give you a series of them to keep going. The Corinthian saints are very affluent, very wealthy, very socially connected, powerful communities, basically, that had gone to the extremes of believing worldly philosophy that the spirit and the body are separate and they don't affect each other. So do good spiritual things to help you for the next life, but do whatever you want with the physical life. And the physical side split into two extremes. One was asceticism, meaning they denied themselves all the feelings and sensations of the flesh. So fasting extreme times, no sex, no relationships, no connections, just lots of prayer and meditation and nothing else. Focus on spiritual, not physical at all. And then the other extreme was doing lots of whatever you wanted physically. Lots of sex, lots of crazy stuff, lots of alcoholism, lots of stuff, because whatever you do in the physical body doesn't matter. So those are the two extremes of dealing with the physical body that Paul is addressing. So when we think about this context, it'll help us to gain a better understanding of what it is that Paul's trying to get across in this chapter as he's talking about marriage, because ascetics don't want marriage, and the extremists see marriage as a hindrance to more sexual promiscuity. So there's problems with both of these. So he's trying to help them come back to the truth. They all have a little bit of a half truth, but he's trying to bring them all back to the center to get where there's more of the full truth. So verse 1, he says, now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me. So again, he's addressing specific issues that are coming back in Chloe's letter and in other letters. It is not good for man to touch a woman. Now I want to look at this, okay? This second part, a lot of scholars look at the second part because this is most likely a quote. This is a complaint out of Chloe's letter. Okay, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. That would be an ascetic type idea, okay? So again, some were very promiscuous, some were promoting abstinence. So that's the challenge is they're going the abstinence ones are saying like, look, you shouldn't ever do anything with a woman. You know, don't touch women, don't have relationships with women. That's not a good thing. That's lust of the flesh. We need to ignore and avoid all lust of the flesh we can. So that's more the ascetic side of things. Whereas there are others that were probably touching women too much, being more promiscuous. So they think that the second half of verse 1, a lot of scholars would say that quote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, is coming from these letters. It's not Paul making a doctrinal statement. It's coming from these letters saying that here's some of the problems, the problem beliefs that these people in Corinth are having. Nevertheless, verse 2, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife. Let every woman have her own husband. So this would be more of a response, basically. To avoid fornication, here's the problem, is you have these desires. Some people want to indulge in those desires. Some people want to avoid those desires completely. And what he's saying is, guys, that's part of the reason you get married, is so that you can deal with those desires. Verse 2, here's a quote from Eric Huntsman's article, The Wisdom of Men, Greek Philosophy, Corinthian Behavior, and the Teachings of Paul. He states about verse 2, he says in chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, Paul again begins by quoting a statement that might have been made by some of the Corinthian ascetics, whom he was correcting. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Here, Joseph Smith, in his new translation, makes it even clearer that this statement was the position of some of the Corinthians, not of Paul, when he rendered the first verse, now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, saying, it is good for man not to touch a woman. So Joseph Smith translation adjusts verse 1 to add the word saying into it, meaning here's something that you believe that's wrong. So can the Bible contain false teachings? It does, right there. Same in the last chapter, we saw that as well. Both woman in verse 1 and wife in verse 2 are translations of forms of the same Greek word gyna, which can mean any woman but a wife in particular. So that's an important thing for us a delineation to look at, okay? The fact that some Corinthians might have gone to the ascetic extreme of not even touching their own wives is suggested by verses 3 through 5, which we're about to read, which refer directly to appropriate physical intimacy within marriage. Some Stoics, for instance, thought that physical intimacy within marriage was justifiable only for procreation. In Paul's discussion in verse 3, the King James Version benevolence, Greek aphelion, literally means that which is owed or one's due or obligation. We're going to see that in verse 3. Okay, so keep that in mind. We might come back to the Greek translation there, which was also a euphemism for pleasing a wife conjugally, leading the New Revised Standard Version to render it, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. While this expression no doubt referred to the full spectrum of mutual interaction appropriate in a marriage, and was probably not limited to giving a spouse his or her due in terms of physical intimacy, Paul clearly saw marital relations as appropriate. In fact, he continues in verse 4 and 5 by stressing that one's spouse, not oneself, has power or exousia, authority or right over one's body, and that spouses should not defraud one another. If for some reason a couple chooses to abstain for a time, they should quickly return to intimacy. So we're going to see this play out. This is one of those chapters where a lot of people have sought to use to justify things with. And so we want to be clear about this. That's why I talked about at the beginning that you could read this chapter to say, here's how I think it interprets to my opinion of today and age. But let's take the time to look at the historical context of what's going on. They have these extremes, ascetics and very promiscuous people. And Paul's trying to bring both groups back to the middle where the truth is. They have a little bit of truth, but they've made a lot of assumptions based on the little truth they have. And he's trying to say, let's get rid of those assumptions and bring those truths together to help you to have more truth. So we see this, okay? Verse 2, he says basically, part of the point of marriage is to deal with the sexual desires you've got. Verse 3, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. Now, like we talked about in that quote, the Greek word for benevolence means what is due to them, basically, the obligation. So what this means is husbands should it is important for husbands to fulfill the sexual desires of their wives. Okay, it is also equally important for wives to fulfill the sexual desires of their husband. Now, there's a lot of ways you could interpret that to say crazy, all kinds of crazy stuff. Now, I think a couple things that are good for us to think about here is, again, the point of sexual intimacy, or one of the points I should say, because I mean, there's an argument to be made procreation is an important part of sexual intimacy. But the point here is about relationship, not procreation. So it is important that we are fulfilling our partners in that relationship, basically. So if one partner is being unfulfilled, maybe because the other one's finishing early or other things like that, and then that person's like, oh, I'm never getting my needs fully met, that's bad. That needs to be corrected, okay? Guys, make sure you are helping your wives feel completely satisfied in that way. Work with them, help them, understand that. When I talk with, I do a little speech with people who are getting married or have just gotten married, and I tell them the goal of that sexual intimacy experience is you focusing on the pleasure of your partner. If you focus on the pleasure of your partner and helping them out, they'll help you take care of your needs. It'll all work out if you focus on them and not yourself. That's an important distinction to make. So that's what we need to look at. Now, so make sure, husbands, that you're not just getting yourself taken care of and not thinking about taking care of your wives. Help your wives. Work with them, understand them, take care of them more. Okay? Now this will change. I will admit this is something that guys have to be careful with, because this will change over time, okay? Intimacy for a wife, and ladies, please correct me if I'm wrong on this. If I'm right, validate this, please. Okay? For a woman, sexual intimacy doesn't necessarily mean orgasm, although I think that's arguably women would like to orgasm every time they have sex. But here's the thing, in order to please my wife over time, it's easy when you're first married. Because if you haven't had a lot of sex, this is kind of new, novel thing, those first few years of marriage, it's not easy, or it is easy, excuse me, to fulfill each other in those ways. But over time, women's needs change in intimacy. So guys, you have to realize that in order to please your wife, that means you might need to wash the dishes more often. And if you want her to please you, you might want to vacuum more often. You might want to clean up. So there's a trade-off that has to happen. This cannot be a one-sided thing. Your wife isn't there to please you, and that's it. She's just not a toy. She's a human. She is a fellow child of God. You need to work with her too. So this is a back and forth, okay? Now, that's important to remember, okay? Take care of the needs of your wife. If you want your wife to help you in the bedroom, help her, okay? She has a much easier time helping you when her brain's not thinking about, I wish I'd rather washing dishes right now because that needs to be done, or folding the laundry, or the front room needs to be cleaned up, or whatever, the lawn needs to be mowed or things like that. So do not discount the things your wife is encouraging you to do. That's important for, I think, for men to understand. Okay, pay attention to her needs. Understand that if you're helping her meet her needs, which really from an intimacy doesn't mean sex all the time. Intimacy can mean he values my opinion. He's wanting to do things with me, like go shopping with me. Maybe that's he's willing to help bear the load of cleaning the house and taking care of the kids and things like that. If you're helping with those things, she'll be more than happy to take care of you in the bedroom. And again, ladies, validate me if I'm right on that and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I'd like to see that, okay? Now, on the flip side of this as well, there is, as he says here, likewise also the wife to the husband. So, ladies, I totally understand that your need, the frequency of sex, isn't as great with you over time than it is with your husband. Okay. Again, when you're fresh and new and young, it's not hard to do. But understand, okay, I know that you just understand that your needs for sexual intimacy will change over time. You're not going to need it as much or be inclined to do that as much as you get older. For guys, that need never changes. It's always there. So women can go wrong in imposing their ideas of how often they should have sex onto their relationship. They need to understand that men will have those feelings and want to do that more often. That doesn't mean they need to be available every time their husband is interested, because that could turn into potential problems by itself. But again, if the goal is how can I help take care of the needs of my partner in this relationship, then that will drive things. Okay. Now, both of you have to have common sense. I mean, obviously, guys, if you're in the mood but your wife is sick, well, you just might have to take a cold shower or just admit the phrase, this too shall pass. Okay. Sexual feelings, sexual emotions, as much as it can hurt and have an actual tangible sense of pain for a man, if they don't get fulfilled, it will go away and you'll be fine. You'll be okay. Don't worry about it. But also for women, if your husband is in the mood and you're not, you may have to look at it and go, okay, well, yeah, maybe I should help him out. Now, how you resolve that, how you help him out is up to the two of you. I'm not going to put limitations on what you do in that moment. That's between the two of you to figure out. But this is what Paul's getting at here, okay? Is they're both parties need to have common sense in this and work together to help each other. If you isolate out, and sometimes I think this is more common for women to do this, sometimes they have past traumas that maybe they were abused as a child, and so now they're getting married, and now that is bringing up the abuse, and so they don't want to be intimate with their husband because it brings up the abuse, and so it's not a good experience. Maybe there's some therapy that needs to be dealt with before, to work with that, or other things. Okay, I've heard of cases where the wives are like, I just have zero interest. I'm not going to do it at all. And the men will go months and months and months and have no outlet for that. And honestly, ladies, understand this. Okay, let me give you an example. Okay, imagine, ladies, that to leave your house, you had to walk through a chocolate factory. What if you walked through a factory that made sweets all day long, but you couldn't touch any of the sweets? To get to your garage, to get to your car, to leave for the day, and then to come home, you had to walk through that factory. But you couldn't eat any of the chocolates that are sitting on the counters around you. Okay, that's kind of what it feels like to be a guy. You have those emotions. You want to have that intimacy. There's serious, intense feelings that guys have, and they can manifest as actual little physical pain for guys if it doesn't get met. And if there's no outlet, that becomes a problem. That's where their immorality is so rampant that it is easy for guys to find an outlet in an inappropriate way. So we need to be careful with that. Okay. Again, how often you and your spouse handle this and take care of this is subjective to the two of you to decide. But the focus should always be, how can I help take care of the needs of my partner? Focus on that. And that'll make such a difference in your marriage. It'll help out a lot. So, anyways, let's move forward here. Verse 4. Okay, I like this one. This is gonna be a great one. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife. This is awesome to think about. Okay, this is a fun one to look at, because when we think of this idea, okay, I like this concept. I thought this was a great one. So men, think about this. Okay, your genitals are not owned by you. You are the caretaker of them, but your wife controls them. Okay, now in this way of thinking about this, that would make, there's some assumptions to make, meaning if you want to use your genitals to pleasure yourself with anybody but your wife, you should ask her permission because she owns it. You kind of see where Paul's coming from on that? Like, oh, that's an interesting concept to think about, and vice versa. Okay. That would solve, if this was a literal thing, like people really thought that way and literally did it that way, it would be wild. It would be absolutely amazing. Oh yeah, well, if I'm going to have to ask my wife for permission to sleep with somebody else, I'm never going to sleep with somebody else. So that's kind of what he's getting at here, basically, is this. This is a concept to help people stay morally clean, is what he's getting at here. So now here in verse 5, he says, defraud ye not one the other. Basically, if your wife owns them, don't defraud it. Don't go against your wife. You've made a covenant and a promise with your wife. Don't break it. And wives for husbands too. Except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. So Paul warns, this is according to Wayman in his book, The New Testament, Paul warns those who have decided to forego marital intimacy to beware that they will be tempted, because during such times they lack self-control. Many later Greek manuscripts read to prayer and fasting. The addition likely reflects a later interest in asceticism, or the interest to implement a more rigorous set of physical commandments. So what he's saying here basically is, look, if you decide not to have sex for a while, that's okay. But realize that this could be a problem. Okay, if you're like, hey, look, I need to fast and pray, I need to be careful with this, I need to kind of not have intimacy for a while so that I can fast and pray and focus on things, okay. But realize that Satan's going to try to push you and tempt you in that as well. That's going to be an opportunity for him to try to break your dedication. So just understand that maybe you need to come back together to have that intimacy, to get that taken care of at some point as well. So don't just not do it ever again, but realize that, okay, maybe there's times where it's okay, and maybe there's times where I need to not do it so that I can focus on more spiritual things. That's okay. Now, I want to point out too with this, there's another assumption that we could make in here in verse 5. If you need a lot of God's help in your life, maybe setting aside some of these worldly things for a short period of time might enhance that fasting and prayer to get the answers you're looking for. Maybe that's also a good reason why avoiding pornography and other types of immorality is good, to help clear our brains so that we can be better focused on the things of God. Do you see where he's kind of making this implication that sometimes putting the sexual stuff away is going to be important for our spirituality? So just because we have sexual desires doesn't mean we should have them control us, or we should follow them all the time. Maybe they need to be set aside. Maybe we need to be willing to leave them alone, even for a short period of time. So something to think about, some ideas to get us going on that. Now verse 6, he does put a qualifier on his advice here, though. He says, but I speak this by permission and not of commandment. So he's not making them follow this guidance. He's giving them recommendations. He's not trying to say this is the doctrinal truth, but he's giving them good advice, basically. Now verse 7, he says here, for I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift, one after this manner, and another after that. So he's realizing, I can't give you blanket advice for everybody to follow, basically. In fact, in Eric Huntsman's article, The Wisdom of Men, he said this. He said, verses 7 through 9 of this chapter, Paul continues by wishing that all men were even as himself, and then counseling the unmarried and widows to abide even as I. While this presumably meant being properly intimate within marriage and chaste without, this counsel may actually have applied to an even narrower group. While unmarried is the literal translation of the Greek agamois, in this context, its masculine plural form might actually be parallel with widows, since Greek did not have a word that it regularly used to mean widowers. In this case, Paul was not addressing all unmarried people, but just those who had lost spouses through death. Even if Paul had meant a wider category, including all who were widowed, divorced, or never married, his advice to the unmarried is the same, which is, but if they cannot contain or exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn, which is parusthai, which here can mean burn with passion, which the new translation rendered, but if they cannot abide, let them marry, for it is better to marry than any should commit sin. The Joseph Smith translation adds that adjustment too. If Paul himself fell into this category, having previously lost his wife and then choosing not to remarry, his suggestion that this group remain as I in verse 8 is the same as his counsel in verse 40 that widows would do better if they did not remarry. Carefully noted that this was his own opinion. Nevertheless, the ascetics at Corinth may in fact have drawn the wrong lesson from Paul's example, thinking that he felt that celibacy was the preferred state for all, so he hastened in verse 39 to stress that a widow was free to marry again as long as it was in the Lord. So that's what he says here in verse 8. I say therefore unto the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. So again, he is unmarried at this point. Now we think Paul had a wife. We don't know much about her. We don't know what happened to her, but maybe he is a widower. And he's like, it's better if you're like me. I'm a widower and I'm not seeking another relationship. Therefore, I don't do the intimacy stuff anymore. He says that's a better way to go. But if you can't, if that lust is building up in you, yeah, it's better that you get married rather than do something wrong, basically. He says here, verse 9, but if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. So it's better to get married than end up with immoral problems. Verse 10, he says, and unto the married I command. So now this is not just his advice, but a commandment. I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. Okay, now this is, so he's saying, I'm going to give you a commandment. It's not my commandment. This comes from God, that let not the wife depart from her husband. And if, so this is verse 11, if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So divorce was certainly not a problem limited to the educated elite in Corinth. But the philosophical view that encouraged a negative view of marital intimacy in verses 1 through 6 might have encouraged some, paradoxically, to consider ending their marriages for allegedly spiritual reasons. This may have been one of the factors that led Paul to strongly restate the commandment of Jesus that a wife should not leave her husband and a man should not put away or divorce his wife. Paul then proceeded to give some counsel regarding a scenario not treated by the surviving teachings of Jesus, at least during his mortal ministry. He says, but to the rest I speak, I, not the Lord, if any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart, and a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. So while that is actually, as he's moving on here, he'll say that. So we're going to kind of go over that again here in a second. While this passage is less clearly connected to the philosophical issues that are an undercurrent in some of the other material under discussion, its context suggests the possibility that the ascetics or spirituals in Corinth already disposed against marriage were encouraging those of their number in mixed marriages to use the unbelief of their spouses as a reason to leave their partners. Jesus had not directly treated this issue, but Paul's opinion is just the opposite of his opponent's. People in these situations should make every effort to make the relationship work, as is the case in every age. The well-being of children is an important consideration in such marital decisions. And Latter-day Revelation for LDS people suggests that this was a particular problem for Jewish Christians whose non-Christian spouses were anxious to have their children raised as observant Jews. Verse 14 refers to the status of children in mixed marriages who might have been unclean but are now holy. In January of 1832, this statement seems to have prompted Joseph Smith, who was engaged in the New Testament translation at the time, to inquire of the Lord, no doubt because he understood that young children were incapable of sinning. In response, he received a revelation explaining that some Jewish men married to Christian women wanted their children circumcised so that they would be ritually pure or clean according to the law of Moses. Apparently, many of these children who were holy because they were sanctified by the atonement of Jesus Christ were later prone to leaving the faith when they came of age because of the influence of their fathers. While these verses thus had particular application for some Jewish Christians or those Gentile Christians married to Jews in Corinth, one can easily imagine the conflict that could arise in Christian pagan unions as well. Aside from concerns about children, the thrust of this advice is clear. The sanctity of marriage is such that even in cases of spiritual asymmetry, separation and divorce should be avoided if the partners can continue to live together amicably. However, if the unbeliever wished to depart, the believer was to allow him or her to leave, although whether Paul felt the abandoned believer was then free to remarry is unclear. So this is really interesting because we don't have, Paul's trying to say this is a commandment from God, but we don't have where this is necessarily like Jesus said this, basically. So there's possible sayings, Matthew 5:31 and 32, Matthew 19:3-9, and Mark 10:7 and 12, 7 through 12. Those might be references, if you want to look those up, that could, where maybe Paul's pulling from the teachings of Christ to get this idea, basically. Because he says here, okay, so, let not your wife depart from her, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. So reconciled, let's talk about this in verse 11 for a second here. If the wife leaves, okay, if she depart, let her remain unmarried. So a woman could be with one man, and then if she gets a divorce from him, she should remain celibate after that, okay, or be reconciled to her husband, meaning this means to have two people reconciled together again, a renewing of a marriage covenant for a couple who have separated. This is also used to talk about the atonement of Christ. So again, in their culture, women could not get a divorce. The men had to issue the divorce, basically, to do that. Women couldn't just ask for divorce themselves. There was no such thing back then as a no-fault divorce. You had to have a reason to give a divorce. So when you're married, and you don't leave this unless somebody sleeps with someone else outside the marriage. Then either party could encourage the divorce, but mainly the men, even if the women wanted to encourage it, the men had to sign off on it. But also, in the same vein, men should not put away their wife for no reason, just to go after other women or do other things, basically. So he's saying you got to be careful with how, on both sides of this. And then in verse 12, of course, but to the rest I speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to do well with him, let him not put her away. So again, just because your spouse is unbelieving in the same faith you have, isn't grounds for divorce. If you can live amicably together, that's better for you, basically. And then verse 13, and the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. And verse 14 brings up some interesting ideas here. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. So the literal problem that's happening here is maybe the husband is Jew and the wife is a Christian. The Jew says, I want all of our kids to be circumcised, so that fits the law of Moses. And the wife's going, I don't know if that's going to be right. According to her religion, they're okay because she's okay. So they're not automatically, because in the Jews' philosophy, in the Jews' philosophy, the children are automatically unclean. In the Christian philosophy, no, you start out clean and fine, and then you have to sin to get out of that. So a different perspective of this, basically, that's happening here. But again, he goes in verse 15, but if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. So if you can't make it work, it's okay. Let him depart. Okay, a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. Another way we could say this is harmony. Okay, whether you both believe the same thing, believe two different things, the goal is seeking harmony with each other. Can we still work together? Can we be in harmony with each other? Can we respect the differences and allow that to happen? That's what God's looking at. It's more harmony. Okay, so we need to be careful. Sometimes we think about this as like it's a justice issue, like, oh, they're wrong and I'm right, so I've got to let go of them. No. Harmony. Seek harmony with each other. That will help in the long run for everybody. Okay, that's important. In fact, in the New Testament study manual, they said Paul counseled members who were married to unbelievers not to divorce their spouses on the grounds of their unbelief, but to remain married and live as faithful followers of Christ. In doing so, a marriage partner can become the means of sanctifying the unbelieving spouse. In 1832, as the prophet Joseph Smith was seeking to better understand Corinthians 7:14, he received the revelation recorded in Doctrine and Covenants section 74, which we talked about earlier in the chapter, which provides important context for the problem Paul was addressing. So for Latter-day Saints, to get even more context, section 74 is because Joseph Smith was going through the translation of the New Testament and came across 1 Corinthians 7:14 and went, let's ask God more. And that's where Revelation section 74 came from. So the Doctrine and Covenants gives us tons of insight because it's because of Joseph Smith's translation that we have most of the Doctrine and Covenants today, which is really cool. So that's where that comes from, is understanding that there were challenges, there were problems that they were having. And Paul's trying to say, guys, let's just seek more harmony and love with each other. Okay, that's important. That's what we should be looking at. Now verse 16, for what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? He's saying, you never know, maybe your husband or wife that's the non-believer will come around as you faithfully serve your religion. Maybe it'll influence them and they'll go, maybe I should go that way. That could be an opportunity. Now verse 17, he says, but as God hath distributed to every man, and as the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. So essentially, be content with where the Lord has called you to be. Don't try to like, oh, I'm better than everybody else, or I should go over there because that's better over there than over here. He's like, guys, just be content with where you're at. Don't try to seek for more leadership or power or, all these other little things. Just be content where you're at. Follow God, keep moving forward, and everything will work out. You'll be fine. Now, in fact, verse 18, Paul's going to bring up another one of these questions. He says, is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any man called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. Now let's talk about this for a second here, because he's bringing up this idea of uncircumcision in here, okay? He's trying to say whether you're circumcised or not, it doesn't matter, okay? But some people, here's what was happening. Some people were Jewish, so they got circumcised, and then they switched to Christianity, but they're still circumcised, and so they were looking at getting the foreskin reattached to look like they were uncircumcised. This is called epispasm. Okay, this is the medical procedure to make you look like you're not circumcised. These are people who are embarrassed by their covenant symbol and want to be Hellenized and be like everyone else. It was very common for Greek culture to be naked among everyone, which meant you knew who was circumcised and who wasn't, because there was, like in bathhouses and other places in sports, everybody was naked. These are where conversations and deals were done, and they're leaving their covenant. So this is an idea of they're circumcised, and now they don't want to be circumcised anymore because they see that as an embarrassment to them, because other people are making it an issue. And he's going, guys, it's not an issue. Don't worry about it. It's not the look of your penis, basically, that makes the difference. It's keeping the commandments of God, the internal stuff that makes a difference, okay? Now, we've brought this up before in our conversations in the book of Romans about grace, that it's not just grace, believing in God, that saves you. Because, again, as he says here, keeping the commandments of God. So there's still things you need to do to have that grace affect you in your life. Keep the commandments is the demonstration of our faith in God, which allows then our faith to work with the grace of God to save us. So commandments, doing things, does help. It can't do it by itself, but it does help. So verse 20, he says, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Elder Uchtdorf's lift where you stand analogy works great for that one. Verse 21, art thou being called a servant? Care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise also he that is called, being free, is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price. Be ye not the servants of men. Now, this is the second time this has come up. We saw this, I believe it was the last chapter, bought with a price. So he's talking about this idea of indentured servitude or slavery, basically. He says, look, you can be a slave to men or you can be a slave to God. It's better to be a slave to God than anybody else. And God's paid the price for you. Serve God, not man, basically. Now, verse 24, brethren, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God. Now, that word brethren is in the Greek is just a generic term for people. So men and women. Let every man and woman wherein he is called, therein abide with God, basically. Verse 25, he says, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. So what he's saying in here is one of Paul's most discussed pieces of counsel regarding marriage revolves around his suggestion that given the present distress, we're going to see that here in verse 26, he says, I suppose therefore that this is good for the present distress, I say, that it is good for a man so to be, meaning virgin. Okay, if you are a virgin, he's saying I don't really have a commandment around what to do, but my wisdom is I think it's best for you to stay a virgin at this point with some of the challenges we have going on. This passage has been a difficult one for Latter-day Saints and for many Protestants, and discussion has focused both on which group Paul is addressing in verse 25 when he writes concerning virgins, and on what that means. So here, Paul clearly states that he has no commandment of the Lord and is only giving his judgment, which we have seen earlier can mean opinion. Nevertheless, Paul strengthens his position by stressing that he is giving his advice as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful, where faithful, pistos, can also be translated as trustworthy or reliable, no doubt because he is teaching as an apostle. Proposals regarding who the virgins are in the context have included young unmarried women whom their fathers are considering giving in marriage, unmarried women or men, engaged women whom with their fiancés are being pressured by the ascetics or spirituals not to marry, or even married partners who because of incorrect asceticism are choosing not to consummate their unions. So there's a lot of ways you could see this idea of a virgin or somebody who's not being intimate, whether they were before and now they've taken a vow of celibacy, or they've never been, or they're engaged. There's a few different descriptions of who could be that audience. While the latter two possibilities fit the situation in Corinth, parenthos can be either masculine or feminine, and in verse 26, Paul advises that remaining unmarried in this situation is good for any person. Suggesting that here he is referring to any unmarried man or woman. Attention naturally turns to what the present distress was that led Paul to suggest that those who had not married should not consider marrying at that time. The word for distress, anagken, I'm probably slaughtering the Greek, sorry, literally something that pinches, can also be translated as calamity, pressure, crisis, or necessity. The question then is whether the crisis or distress was current or one that was about to occur, both of which can be legitimate interpretations of this word. Because Paul means trouble, in verse 28 using a word meaning affliction or tribulation that is often used in an apocalyptic context. A common approach has been to see the early apocalypticism frequently found in Paul's early letters here. Since the end was coming soon, again, a lot of people thought Christ was coming for a second coming soon, it would be better not to initiate new marriages given the sufferings that were to precede the Lord's return. So in one way, we could look at this and say that Paul's saying, you know what, since Christ is coming back to earth soon, and there's going to be all kinds of crazy calamities just before he does, it's maybe not a good idea to get married at this point. Not add to the challenges and problems that we're about to have. But then the article says here, nevertheless, enestosan is in the perfect tense, making it more likely that this was a situation that had been impending, and hence was then present when Paul wrote. This encourages us to see immediate problems ranging from external persecution to purely local problems such as famine and other unknown forms of distress that led Paul to worry about the troubles that his converts and the families that they started should they marry in this situation might experience. So he could be saying, maybe he's talking about calamity. So maybe there's a major famine, and getting married and having a family means you're starting on your own, and so it's going to be even harder to start on your own because you've got poor economic conditions. So he's like, in that situation, maybe it'd be best to just not get married. Now, continuing on here, aside from this exegesis or close reading and interpretation of the text as it has survived, Latter-day Saints have recourse to the New Testament translation of Joseph Smith, which expands the received text as follows. So Joseph Smith's translation has expanded what these verses say to say, I suppose therefore that this is good for the present distress, for a man so to remain that he may do greater good. But I speak unto you who are called unto the ministry, for this I say, brethren, that the time that remaineth is but short, that ye shall be sent forth unto the ministry. Even they who have wives shall be as though they had none, for they are called and chosen to do the Lord's work. So ministry here has generally been assumed to refer to full-time missionary work, such as that in which Paul himself was engaged, suggesting that those who were married would need to be apart from their spouses for extended periods of time, and those who had not yet married might best wait until their calls were completed. While this application of verse 25 through 31 certainly resolves a particular concern with Paul's position, the final part of this section, verses 32 through 35, remains difficult. And we're going to get into those here in a minute here. But he says, Paul begins this section by writing the following in verses 32 and to 33. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. Paul makes it clear that marrying is certainly not a sin in the next section. So without espousing celibacy as a preferred option, the best approach seems to be to apply the counsel in purely practical terms, acknowledging the fact that those who do not have an opportunity to marry or otherwise cannot marry certainly can please the Lord because of their often greater freedom to serve him. Those who have family responsibilities must divide their time and, as it were, their loyalties. Joseph Smith seemed to acknowledge this practical approach when he added a clause to the end of each verse, for he who is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, that how he may please the Lord. Therefore he prevaileth. But he who is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. Therefore there is a difference, for he is hindered. Taken with the earlier counsel given to those called to ministry, Paul may have simply been acknowledging that for certain calls, being unmarried or away from one's spouse allowed for devoted, concentrated service to the Lord. Still, given Paul's earlier encouragement that others, presumably widows, widowers, and otherwise unmarried, many commentators have continued to assume that Paul's opinion was that celibacy was preferable. However, given the philosophical bent of some whom Paul seems to be correcting, Paul's counsel might possibly have had a more nuanced application to his original audience. The Greek adjective ameronymos, translated without carefulness in the King James Version, means free from care or anxiety, and was a term commonly used by cynics and stoics to describe the philosophical state of being freed from worldly anxiety so that one could devote himself more fully to philosophy, Some Stoics, in fact, advised that the wise man espouse celibacy so that he could devote himself completely to contemplation, seemingly parallel to what Paul seems to say about the unmarried being able to devote themselves more fully to the Lord. That's Eric Huntsman's article, The Wisdom of Man, Greek Philosophy, Corinthian Behavior, and the Teachings of Paul. So some people look at this from a more expansive view, and some look at a little bit more narrowed view of what Paul's talking about here. Again, saying that if we think about this idea that Christ is coming again, and there's going to be a lot of hard times coming, maybe it's not a good idea to get married and have to go have a spouse as you're going through all these hard times. But we could also say because of the challenges that they had at the time, they're probably getting some persecution from Jews and from Roman groups as well. They're getting, there could be some famines and challenges economically in the area. It's a struggle. It'd be a real struggle to start a family in that condition. So in some ways, maybe staying celibate would be better. And also we can look at this from the standpoint of if you are wanting to serve God, like be in the ministry, understand that if you are single, it's way easier to focus on the things of God because you don't have any other cares to worry about. If you're married, you have to split your time because you need to take care of your wife. She has an obligation on you as the husband to take care of her. And so you need to do that to take care of your family and serve God, which means it's a more complicated thing for you to do. So those are some of the ways we can look at what Paul's writing in here, basically. So verse 26, I suppose therefore that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for man so to be, meaning celibate. Verse 27, art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. So again, if you have a wife, don't divorce her just so you can go do the ministry stuff. That would be bad. If you don't have a wife, don't worry about getting one if you're going into the ministry. Verse 28, but and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none. So again, if you're going to do the ministry, if you're going to do missionary work and stuff, and you have a wife, you're not going to see your wife a lot. You're going to be gone a lot. So like being called as an apostle, this is a challenge they have because they have to, as much talk as there is that families are important. When you are an apostle, you're called as a special witness of Christ, and so you can't always hang out with your family. You need to be doing the things of God. And so sometimes doing what God wants you to do is more precedent than being with your family. So you have sometimes less time to hang out with your family because you're busy working for God. Verse 30, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belongeth to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. Now, what happened to my stuff here? Let's see. So he's saying here basically this idea of the carefulness that, again, if you're single, you have less holding you down. You can go do ministry stuff and be okay. If you have things to hold you down, like a wife and children, you've got to split your time, and it's going to be harder for you, basically. He's not saying give up your wife and kids and go do the ministry. He's saying you're going to have to split your time because both are valuable. Verse 34, there is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. So again, that's looking from the woman's perspective. Verse 35, and this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, meaning fiancé, basically, and need so require, let him do what he will. He sinneth not, let them marry. So if you're engaged to get married, don't break it off just so you can go teach the gospel. You still need to honor and respect your bride, basically. Verse 37, nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord, meaning that this is basically she's making a covenant to be with God, okay? And so she can, if her husband dies, she can remarry, and there's no fault, basically. But it has to be done the proper way, basically, with proper authority. Verse 40, but she is happier if she so abide. After my judgment, I think also that I have the Spirit of God. So this is a lot for Paul to talk about in this chapter, but a lot of things to hopefully help us think through, hopefully look at this and go, okay, this applies a little bit more to what Paul's issues are, the Corinthian issues are dealing with. That doesn't mean we can't learn lessons from it, but it might be different lessons than if we take this chapter at face value. So that's why it's important to look at the historical context, because it can help us to see other principles and ideas that might be more accurate to what Paul's trying to say, which means we can make sure we're following more of what the truth he's trying to teach rather than our assumption of what we think it is. So, long chapter. I hope you found some good value in this. Let's jump over to our next chapter as we continue to move forward.